Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this next video from the series called Modern Identity powered by Azure. In this video, I would like to talk about single sign-out implementation with Azure Active Directory B2C. I would like to explain some concepts because probably some of you can think that during the logout process, it's enough to delete session cookie or delete all the tokens. But it's not enough. And in this video, I would like to show you how to properly implement sign-out process and also how to implement single sign-out in the Azure AD B2C. So let's start. As always, before we jump into technical demos, it's worth to start with some theory. And before we will continue discussion about single sign-out, let's talk about logout with Azure AD B2C. Logout, what does it mean? So when user clicks logout button in the application, it is a sign that user session should be terminated. It means that user would like to log out from the application. In the web or mobile applications, we can clear cookies and tokens. So this is what we typically do. We delete the token, we delete session cookie, and we think that, okay, right now user is properly signed out from my application. However, such approach is not enough. Why? Let's explain on the next slides. So, what is the proper logout process in the Azure AD B2C? But it's not only about the Azure AD B2C, it's more about the standards like OpenID Connect. So when user clicks logout button in the application, user must be redirected to Azure Active Directory B2C to sign out. Azure AD B2C invalidates the Azure AD B2C cookie-based session for the user. And then Azure AD B2C attempts to sign out from federated identity providers. So let's say that if we use Facebook login on the Azure AD B2C login page, on the logout, Azure AD B2C will try to sign out user from Facebook and also will sign out the user from the B2C. Optionally, sign out from other applications by using single sign-out. So this is basically the topic of this video, how to implement single sign-out. And in the next slides, we will explain those steps, concepts to make sure that you will be able to properly handle single sign-out in your applications secured by Azure AD B2C. Once user is logged out from the Azure AD B2C, application then should clear user session related artifacts, so cookies and tokens. So as you can see, it's not enough to log out user only from the application and clear the session cookie or delete the tokens, because on the Azure AD B2C side, user is still authenticated and there is still the session cookie for the Azure AD B2C. And those are important details. When Azure AD B2C attempts to sign out from the federated identity providers, like Facebook or Google, it will not pass the ID token hint parameter. It's very important. So basically, if your federated identity provider requires ID token hint parameter, the sign out request will fail. And this is really important because I know that some external identity providers require this ID token to be sent on the logout request, and currently B2C, at least per my knowledge, and I didn't find any information about it, Azure AD B2C does not support providing the ID token hint on the logout for those external identity providers. It's possible to disable the sign out from federated identity providers. And this option is available only when using custom policies. It's very important. The identity provider technical profile metadata called single logout enable has to be set to false. And then during the logout process, B2C will not call this external identity provider to sign out the user. By default, user is only log out from the current application. User remains authenticated in other applications that use Azure AD B2C for authentication. And this is very important because when we log out the user, what happens is the process where we will call B2C, B2C will clear the session cookie, then on the application side, we will clear the application session cookie and tokens. But of course, when user was authenticated in another application and let's say on another device, this logout will not work. So let's summarize the typical logout flow on this diagram. So user clicks logout button in the application. User is redirected to the end session endpoint URL. So Azure AD B2C can invalidate cookie-based session. So if you watched my previous video about the single sign-out, you know that Azure AD B2C drops its own session cookie for the user under the specific B2C domain. So what will happen? Azure AD B2C can invalidate this cookie-based session. And obviously this cookie is deleted. And after a successful logout, user is redirected from the B2C to the post-logout redirect URL. And just to clarify, in this video, I focus on the OpenID Connect protocol, not SAML. So I just want you to know that in this specific video, I only discuss the concepts around OpenID Connect. But obviously, when you will open documentation for single sign-out for the B2C, you will find explanation also for SAML protocol. And basically, when it comes to concepts, it works very similar. So you can still get good knowledge from this explanation. And after this successful redirect, application deletes user session cookie and all the tokens like ID token, refresh token, access token, and so on. So all those artifacts. And when it comes to logout process, this is simple when we have one application that is used by one user. But what about single sign-out with Azure AD B2C? So what is happening in the situation when we have multiple applications secured by Azure AD B2C and user is authenticated in multiple applications, let's say on multiple devices, and then we would like to sign out the user once the user clicks logout button in one application. So let's discuss this process. It's more advanced, but still I think that after a little bit of clarification, it becomes quite simple. So what is the flow for the single sign-out with Azure AD B2C? User clicks logout button in the application, so exactly the same process like in the standard logout. User is redirected to the end session endpoint URL, so Azure AD B2C again can invalidate cookie-based session and delete the session cookie. Azure AD B2C then will simultaneously send an HTTP GET request to the registered logout URL of all the applications that the user is currently signed into. And that's very important. So if in one application I click logout button, I was redirected to the B2C. Now B2C will call all other applications where I have existing session using GET method, HTTP GET method, and B2C will try to call those endpoints of other applications to inform those applications that those applications should sign out the user too. So when all applications have been notified of the logout, the user is redirected to the requested post-logout redirect URI, including the optional state parameter specified in the initial request. So that's very important. So we click logout button, we are redirected to the Azure AD B2C. Azure AD B2C is using hidden iframe, which I will describe in a minute. And B2C calls all other applications using HTTP GET to sign out the user. And once all the applications are notified, user is redirected to the application that initialized the logout process, and then application can delete all the cookies, tokens again, and clear the user's session. Perfect. So what is happening when application is called by the Azure AD B2C? So application should clear all the cookies related with the currently signed in user, and application should delete all the tokens retrieved after user's authentication. So when Azure AD B2C will call those applications using HTTP GET, those applications should react. And this is on us developers to implement this sign-out process correctly. So on the application side, we should implement the endpoint to handle this HTTP GET. We should handle in the code the process of clearing the cookies and deleting all the tokens. Important facts here. This is really important. When Azure AD B2C receives the logout request, it uses a front channel HTML iframe to send an HTTP GET request to the requested logout URL of each participating application that the user is currently signed into. And that's very important because there are two ways basically in the OpenID Connect specification to handle logout. It can be front channel and back channel. Azure AD B2C uses front channel HTML iframe to send this HTTP GET request to those applications that should log out the user. The application that triggers the sign-out request will not get this logout message. This is really important. So the application that initialized the logout process will not receive this HTTP GET request. This is really important. So once all other applications are successfully called, B2C will redirect user to this application, and then application should clear session cookie, tokens, and present the login screen again. It's important to mention that we can secure logout redirect URL. So when we do this redirection to the Azure AD B2C, we define post logout redirect URI. So this is the place where user will be redirected after successful logout process. And we can secure this redirect URL because if we will not secure it, by default we can pass any logout redirect URI, and then B2C will use it for the redirection after a successful logout. But if we decide to secure logout redirect URL, this post logout redirect URI has to match the redirect URIs registered for application in the Azure AD B2C. So let's talk about some details. Basically, when it comes to secure logout redirect URI, it is required to provide ID token in the logout request. So when we send this logout request to the Azure AD B2C, we have to include ID token of the currently authenticated user in our application. It means that during the logout, applications must pass ID token hint parameter. Yes, just to clarify. This parameter is the ID token that contains information about currently authenticated user in our application. Azure AD B2C verifies that the value of the post logout redirect URI matches one of the application's configured redirect URIs before performing the redirect. And that's very important. So if the redirect URI is not specified, under redirect URIs in the application registration on the B2C side, this redirection will be stopped. So we will see the error message and B2C will not do the redirection. So if no matching reply URL was found or configured for the application, an error message is displayed and the user is not redirected. That's very important. And obviously, we can enable this feature in user flows, as you can see. So we can enable require ID token in logout requests. And if we use custom policies under single sign-on tag, we can add enforce ID token hint on logout, and we have to set it to true. Okay, perfect. So this was about the logout, single logout, and some steps. But again, it can be tricky. That's why I would like to talk also about cookie configuration. So as you probably know, every cookie has a domain associated with it. So for instance, with my Azure AD B2C, I have this cookie associated with the domain login.techmindfactoryidentity.org. So having that said, it's important to understand cookie configuration when we want to implement single sign-out process with the Azure AD B2C. Let's talk a little bit more about cookies here. Cookie access in a same site or first-party context occurs when a cookie domain matches the website domain in the user's address bar. So as you can see on the right side, if cookie domain matches the address that is displayed in the address bar of the browser, we say that cookie access is in a same site or in the first-party context. If a cookie is only intended to be accessed in a first-party context, the developer has the option to apply one of two settings. For the cookie, obviously, same site lax or same site strict to prevent external access. So let's dive a little bit more into this configuration. If the domain associated with a cookie matches an external service and not the website in the user's address bar in the browser, this is considered as cross-site or third-party context. And this is very, very important from the single sign-out perspective, and we will discover soon why. So, if the cookie's domain does not match the address bar in the browser, we say that it's cross-site or third-party context access. So now let's talk more about same-site attribute for the cookie. So let's start with the same-site strict. It means that the browser sends the cookie only for the same-site requests, that is, requests originating from the same site that set the cookie. There is no cookie sharing possible. So it means that if the domain of the cookie doesn't match the URL displayed in the bar in the browser, cookie will not be sent. Other configuration is same site lax. Lax allows the cookie to be sent on some cross-site requests, but only when safe HTTP methods are used, like get, head, trace, or options. And the top-level navigation is used, so address is visible under user's address bar in the browser. It means that requests in iframe will not work. So it's very important because some people are surprised that even if they use safe HTTP method like get and they have same site lax configured and they use iframe, they still cannot access cookie. So it's very important to understand that with same site lax, you won't be able to access cookies from the iframe. So there is a third configuration, same site known. So known allows the cookie to be intentionally shared in a third-party context. It means that requests in iframe will work as expected. However, additional secure attribute has to be set for the cookie. So they can only be shared when HTTPS is used. Okay, why is it important? Why I'm talking about it here when we talk about single sign-out with Azure AD B2C? To make it possible to clear the cookies on the application side when Azure AD B2C sends HTTP GET request, we have to set the application cookie to same site none, and we have to add secure attribute. Again, why can we use same site lax? We cannot use it because Azure AD B2C uses hidden iframe to make HTTP GET, so safe method. So it means that we have to use same site none and add secure attribute. So now it's time to see it in action. So let's see the single sign-out in action with Azure AD B2C. Here are my two demo applications. One is hosted in the Azure cloud and one is launched on the local host. Let's sign in to the application hosted in the Azure cloud. I will click Login button and I'm successfully redirected to the login page of my Azure AD B2C tenant. Let's provide credentials really quickly. Then I have to click Sign In button and I'm successfully authenticated and redirected back to the application. And we can see the greeting, "Hello, Daniel." And now I will open the application launched on the local host. I will click Login button and I'm authenticated automatically because of the fact that single sign-on works correctly. If you want to learn more about SSO with Azure AD B2C, I recommend checking my other video on my channel. Perfect. So right now, let's see what will happen when I will log out from this application hosted in the Azure cloud and what will happen in this application launched on the local host. So I will click Logout button here. As we can see, I'm successfully logged out from the application. And now let's see what happened in the application launched on the local host. As you can see, there is overlay displayed with the clear information. Your session finished on the Azure AD B2C side. You log out in another application and single logout worked as expected. Log in again. And here, once I will click it, I will be redirected to the login page. And if I will get back, we can see that the session for my user ended. So all the cookies, tokens were cleared out from my application, and to use application, I have to log in again. Now let's see what is happening from the networking perspective. So how Azure AD B2C calls those other applications to sign out the user. So here is my application hosted in the Azure cloud. As you can see, I'm already authenticated in this app. And in another tab, I have this application launched on the local host, and I'm also authenticated here. So now what I will do, I will enable recording network activity and I will click Logout button. And now, as you can see, some requests are sent. Let me disable capturing the network traffic. And let's see what happened here. First of all, as you can see, the logout URL was called from the application, so user was redirected to the B2C. When we look into the payload, we will see that ID token hint was included in this logout request. So my post logout redirect URI is secured because in this case, I enabled this functionality. As I mentioned before, I have to attach ID token hint to the logout request, and then B2C will validate if the post logout redirect URI matches one of the addresses I registered as redirect URI for the application registered in the Azure AD B2C. So that's very important. As you can see here, I have to provide this ID token hint. Also, when we will look into Initiator tab, we can see what happened here underneath when it comes to network traffic. And as you can see, obviously we called the logout URL of the Azure AD B2C, but below you can see that also the remote sign out endpoint was called on my application launched on the local host. So if I will open remote sign out, you will see that I instantiated sign out operation from my application in the Azure cloud, but because of the fact that single sign out is implemented, Azure AD B2C opened this hidden iframe and also called my application on the local host. And because of the fact that I have this application launched on the local host, I was able to successfully process this sign out request. And that's why we can see this overlay displayed. Perfect. So now let's see what is required for the application registered in the Azure AD B2C. Here are my both applications registered in the Azure AD B2C. So single sign out app and single sign out app 2. And now, what is required to successfully enable single sign-out? We have to define front channel logout URL for our application. So when the user will log out from applications, this URL will be called by the Azure AD B2C. So that's why when we log out from the application hosted in the Azure cloud, we saw in the network traffic that B2C, using the hidden iframe, called this specific remote sign-out endpoint of my application. So right now, let's see and let's look into the application code to see how to properly handle the single sign-out. Here is my Blazor server web application and few important details here. First of all, I use Microsoft Identity Web Library in this application, so the one recommended by Microsoft. And as you can see, in the event called onRedirect to identity provider for sign-out, I'm adding ID token hint. Why? Because I want to secure my post-logout redirect URI. So as mentioned before, ID token hint is required on the logout operation. So that's why I have to attach my existing ID token when I will do this redirection to the logout URL of the Azure AD B2C. So this is very important. ID token hint has to be included here because Azure AD B2C will display error after the logout operation. As you remember, I also mentioned that specific cookie configuration is required to make sure that single sign-out with Azure AD B2C will work properly with applications. So that's why here in the code, I have to configure cookie authentication options. As you can see, I set the name for my cookie. I have to also set same site attribute to known. As you remember, I mentioned that because of the fact that Azure AD B2C calls applications through the hidden iframe, we have to set this same site attribute to known to make sure that we will be able to access cookies and clear them out. And also we have to set secure policy to always. So this communication is always encrypted and always uses HTTPS. Perfect. So once we apply such configuration, single sign-out will work properly in our application. And you can try it yourself. You can, for instance, change the same site attribute to lax, and then you will see that single sign-out will not work. Another thing is that, as I mentioned, Azure AD B2C will call my application using safe getHTTP method so I can properly sign out the user. So as you can see below, I have this method called remote signout. So this method, basically what we'll do, this method will handle this request sent by the Azure AD B2C, and this method will log out the user. And in this specific scenario, as we saw, I was able to log out the user and also display the information on the overlay. So here I have this user session state service and I'm calling update session state and I'm displaying this overlay to the user. And one important detail here, very important to be mentioned. The application that is called by the Azure AD B2C on the single sign out doesn't have to do the redirection to the B2C again. So this application should only clear the cookies, clear the tokens, and that's it. So no additional redirection is required because the application that initialized logout operation did that. So in the initial application, like in my example, hosted in the Azure cloud, I clicked logout button, I was redirected to the B2C. B2C called my other applications, so the one hosted on the local host in this specific scenario. And then after that, user was redirected back to the application. So in this specific scenario, in those applications called by the Azure AD B2C, you do not have to do any redirection. You have to just make sure that you will clear cookies, tokens, and basically you will handle this experience. So that's why in my example you saw that I used this overlay to inform the user that, hey, your session expired and you log out from the application and you have to sign in again. Perfect. So one last thing, I'm using custom policies in this solution. So let me show you how to enable this call from the Azure AD B2C in the custom policies. Here is my base custom policy, and as you can see, here is the technical profile called job issuer. So basically, this technical profile is responsible for handling the session, user authentication, and issuing tokens. And as you can see, under the output claims, I have to add use technical profile for session management. And here I reference this SM OAuth issuer technical profile. So let's look into this technical profile. And this profile is required to handle single logout. So when you will open documentation for single sign out for the Azure AD B2C for the custom policies, you will see that this specific technical profile is required. So then once you add this profile here, Azure AD B2C will be able to call your applications using the front channel URL. Okay, perfect. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you found it interesting and helpful. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next videos.